My name is Philippa Hedley Takhar and I'm here to talk about Devices for Dignity, one of the 11 national MedTech cooperatives funded by the NIHR. And we are all about supporting development of technology for people with long-term conditions. Thinking about the idea of dignity, independence, living well for longer, and considering the different aspects that can affect someone's life if they're living with a long-term condition. And we're very much in this early technology readiness level space, thinking about catalysing from early concept, early needs, thinking about the foundations that will make success in terms of technology development, and looking at that innovation ready activity before moving towards market. And fundamentally, everything we do, we are pulling through that patient and public involvement and engagement piece across all our activity. They are at the heart of the start of every project that we're involved with. We need to understand whether this is, the technology developed is for something which patients want, clinicians want. This is something where there's an unmet need and there's something there in terms of usability and acceptability by the people that we expect to use our devices for managing their long-term conditions. So we work with networks to validate those unmet needs. We think about co-design and co-producing those technologies. We use them in terms of our expert networks. It's at the heart of our activity. And these images here are from an event we had a couple of years ago called My Dignity Means, and it was quotes from people that came along to say, if you're going to invent something, these are the things that we want you to focus on. So although we've been a MedTech cooperative since 2018, we had a previous incarnation as a healthcare technology cooperative. So we've been around about 11 years now. And it's important to note that we're not really about quantity of inquiries and projects, we're about the quality. So we have this funneling system. So we have a way that people approach us for support and engagement with us. And we'll look at the novelty, the unmet need element, the funding resource for this. And then we take that through in terms of the projects that move onto our portfolio. Projects we can't support, we then move into the system through signposting, so they're getting that support. We're very much all about the warm goodbye. We're not going to say, sorry, we can't work with you. We'll get you to where you need to be. And there, at the end of the pipeline, 29 projects. It's a lot less than we've got initial inquiries, but those will be the projects that have had that rigorous, that robust support, CE marked, close to market, in the pipeline, and then work with our colleagues in the Academic Health Science Network to get to market. So this is our innovation cube, and this helps you understand a little bit more about how we work and how we understand unmet need. So our key clinical themes are diabetes, renal technologies and long-term neuro. And our themes to sort of work around that is rehabilitation and assistive tech. But we think about not only the health condition, but also, you know, what does this condition mean why people can't live their lives how they'd like to? So the functional impairments of mobility, self-care, communication, etc. And we also think about the environment in which technology and devices are going to be used. So is it going to be for the home, or is it going to be used in primary care or hospitals or care homes? So we think about these different dimensions of unmet need when we're considering projects to support, and very much thinking about human factors, so behaviour, about usability, about motivations, about how technology is going to sort of play a part in a care pathway. And this is just a brief summary of those themes in terms of the top level headings. So long-term neurological conditions, for example, we had an unmet needs workshop earlier this year where we brought people together to understand the areas of interest. And in particular, in that space, there's balance, mobility, environment, communication. Arm function was something which came up a lot, monitoring, remote support. So there's a lot of kind of subcategories of activity within these wider themes. And with renal tech, we're very much looking at simple and more affordable technologies to bring new models of care closer to home. So I just want to run through a few case study examples just to give a feel, because everything we do is bespoke in terms of our activity. And again, looking at kind of these patient public networks that are there at the start, at the end, and all the way through. And this is kind of our innovation journey. Again, it's very hard to draw what a true innovation pathway would look like. But very much starting from unmet needs or ideas can come from a host of sources. It could come from clinicians, academics, patients, parent of somebody with a long-term condition. I didn't mention at the start, but it's crucial to understand we're not just about the elderly and the ageing population, we're about full life course. You could be somebody quite young and have a long-term condition, so we don't want to think that we're about, you know, the ageing and over 65s. It's the full life course activity. So then we very much get involved in kind of validation of the need, and I can't emphasise enough in terms of that validation and really making sure that unmet need is clarified and understood. Working with networks, looking at bid writing to support the work that we do, and very much thinking about regulatory support, what's going to have to be put in place from a very early stage to move that along. So a few case studies. I wanted to sort of focus on this one because this is almost at that front end activity, and it's a piece of work we did funded by Department of Health and Social Care, and this was about pediatric limb prosthetics. So it very much recognised the work we'd done with our TITCH network, which is a particular network which has been running for some years about child health and identifying unmet needs in that space. And it's a part of our organisation and part of my colleague Abigail's Children and Young People MedTech Cooperative. And through the recognition of that kind of robustness of that activity, we received some funding in order to bring young people and their families together with key opinion leaders from across the network to explore the prosthetics for children and young people. So having those kind of unmet needs events, sandpits, to look at challenge areas and come out with some of those key areas of focus in terms of market activity. And we've been able to then bring forward some proof of concept funding to fund 10 of those next stage projects. So they include websites for families and carers to understand something about limb loss or limb difference and sort of share sort of peer stories, teaching children how to control prosthetic hands through use of gaming experiences, and a first of its kind socket and interface and fit monitoring system. So a series of sensors within the prosthetic with a smartphone app to understand when socket adjustments need to be made. So this has very much got to a point that has emerged from user groups saying this is what we want, this is what we can't find, this is the challenges that we find in terms of young people's prosthetics because of the speed that a young person will grow and that turnover of prosthetic development. So that's an early stage piece. The next one is more about that kind of middle area where we're looking at project management and regulatory activity. This is the non-invasive ventilation mask activity. So non-invasive ventilation, use of a face mask, mass produced in the main and can be very difficult for children to wear if they have asymmetry or facial deformities, and therefore you're not getting the best value from that ventilation mask, and it could result in a tracheostomy in terms of that long-term ventilation. So this is an area where we've been exploring 3D modelling, design and manufacture, the variety of materials and designs to look at how something could be brought into a service for mainstream use, and therefore children are benefiting from a more bespoke mask fitted to their particular needs. And this is something we've been doing with Sheffield Children's Hospital and Professor Elphick there. And this is not just about trying to push technology into a system, it's also thinking about that pathway and thinking about how we can get that clinical pull, the technology push, and think about how the service is going to have to change around this to be able to support this kind of activity. And also wanted to mention there, it talks about successful funding application for NIHR Invention for Innovation, or I4I. So this is the funding which is very, very valuable in terms of de-risking activity that's moving from concept to later stage activity. And we've been very successful over the years in terms of using that funding stream to resource and move forward our partnership activity. So with this, we're doing a lot of project management, we're thinking about commercialisation, we're thinking about regulatory. Further along the journey, in terms of this is actually different in that this is a company came to us in something that they developed and they wanted our support for next stage activity. So this was focused on thinking about swallowing difficulties, perhaps post-stroke or cancer, and the impact that can have on somebody in terms of choking risk or risk of infection. And this American company had come to talk to us because they'd looked at this neck brace with this electrical stimulation and a way of doing various exercises to perhaps rehabilitate that swallow function. So we've done a lot of activity in terms of the CE marking, funding and supporting that delivery of a randomised controlled trial, and thinking about that guidance in terms of training clinicians and getting that into the NHS market. And I think at the present stage we're looking at the next stage trial activity with that. So that was a different way of kind of coming in. It doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's coming in at that early front door of unmet need. It may be that somebody's on that journey and wants that support at that point. And this is a case study which, people that have heard me speak before will have heard of a lot, but it's something which it's very powerful for us because it talks about that whole journey where we've been there at the start when people were saying, it's really great if we could have something that did this, right through to it being sold nationally into over 100 trusts. So this is the head-up collar. So with one of our themes being long-term neurological conditions, there was a group of patients and carers and their families talking about the neck orthosis for head drop and thinking how that impacted communication, dignity, swallowing, eating, etc. And they wanted something a little bit more comfortable to wear, less restrictive, rather than the very kind of medical-looking devices that were used before. And so coming out of that kind of early co-design conversation and working with universities, working with the National MND Association, a charity, Eye for Eye funding, physiotherapists, neurologists, that has gone into the developing of the materials, to how this, it's a collar that kind of, you know, it's a Velcro fit and it can easily removed and placed on, but it looks, you know, it looks smart, it looks a bit more aesthetic than a very medical device. And we've been there throughout the journey, and my colleagues have been very much involved in getting the patents for this, working with the manufacturing sector to identify a manufacturer that was then going to take this to market, looking at that, developing that license deal and commercialisation. And as I said, this is now nationally available, and one of those big case study successes in terms of going all the way from A to B. So how do you talk to us about what we do? So this is our website, and ringed there is our front door. They're looking for collaborators. So we do ask, in terms of that vast pipeline of activity, we ask that people submit a small form which explains where you are in that development journey and what support you're seeking. And I would advise to be as specific as possible, really, rather than just saying, oh, we're seeking funding or we're seeking evaluation. Really get under the nub of, you know, what's that activity, because that helps that triaging process. And I think, and this is a quick snapshot of that menu of services, but we are bespoke in what we do. I think of particular value and particular interest should be that patient and public involvement, the regulatory activity, thinking about our funding proposals and our way to support funding support. And very much we sit with our clinical engineering team, some of the work that they do in terms of prototyping, and their understanding also about how people are de-adopting technology within secondary care, how they're taking devices out that are now no longer appropriate for those particular pathways. So thank you for listening.